Hello, I'm Joseph Haldane, Executive Director of the International Academic Forum, IAFOR, and I'm joined today by Professor Donald E. Hall, who's the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Lehigh University in the United States of America. Professor Hall is a leading figure in the field of queer studies, and Professor Hall, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And I wanted to kick off with a question about, first of all, what is queer studies?
Well, queer studies in many ways originated in the political conflict of the 1980s around the AIDS crisis. And even though the word queer, of course, has been around for centuries, and in the 20th century was widely used as a pejorative against sexual nonconformists, in the 1980s it was reappropriated as a term of radical response to the indifference of the US government in the Reagan administration around funding over HIV and AIDS. So the Queer Nation, which was a movement that was born around 1988, 89, decided to use that term, appropriate that term to say, yes, we're different, but we demand respect. Queer studies grew out of that interest in challenge to what is normal, challenge to oppression. And over the course of the 1990s and then certainly into the 2000s, queer studies, queer theory became itself a field of interdisciplinary explorations of sexuality in some ways, but also more broadly of investigations into how do we define the normal and how do we challenge what is considered socially normal.
Okay, so let's take socially normal and then let's take the Deep South. I know you were born and raised in the Deep South in Birmingham, Alabama. Now, how's that influenced and how's that politicized yourself?
Well, yes, I was born in Birmingham and then raised about an hour outside of Birmingham, Alabama. And Birmingham and really Alabama, the South in general during the 1960s and even today in some ways, was a very politicized environment, especially around issues of race, but also issues of being Southern, segregation, being in the South, issues of class. It was impossible really not to take a stand.
Yeah.
At the same time, and this was when I was in my very early teens, I became very self-aware as a boy who desired other boys. Yes. So I, at that time, really became aware of myself as a political person and someone who was looking for ways to respond to a whole host of political oppressions. And that has really carried me forward to this day and the work that I continue to do today.
Perhaps you can tell us a bit about how your academic career developed, how you began, where you began.
Sure. I actually began my undergraduate career studying political science. So I was actually drawn to intellectual work because of my interest in politics. Now, at the time that I was studying, this was during the late 1970s, it was still very rare for English departments, which is where I eventually got my PhD, to do work that was overtly political. It was still very much close readings of texts. That really turned me off to any sort of form of literary studies at that time. But as I started looking at master's programs and started thinking about where I wanted to do my work, you also saw the rise in the 1980s of academic feminism. So I was drawn finally to work in literary studies because of the commitments of feminists. And I found literary studies, cultural studies more generally, as a terrain upon which one could do actual political work. So that carried me really through many of my early books, which looked at Victorian feminism. I was trained as a Victorianist, gradually looking as well at other forms of both gender and sexual oppression, masculinities, areas of sexuality, of course. And then I turned my interest to the academic community, and I wrote a couple of books on the academic community and community building. At the same time, I was increasingly drawn to administration as a terrain for hands-on political work. So I was a department chair for a while. I ran a big interdisciplinary studies program. And over the course of time, I found that the way that one as an administrator can affect change, can bring about change in the academy, was something that wasn't possible if you were teaching in the classroom or writing books, both of which are very important, both of which I found quite fulfilling. But it really was that political sort of position of the administrator that allowed one to negotiate and then see change through. So 3 years ago, I was named Dean of Arts and Sciences at Lehigh University, which is a university known for its interdisciplinary work. It's what attracted me there. And I can say that I tell all academics, if they have the skill set, they have the patience, that really an administrative career, if you have strong political commitments, is a place where you can make a lot of difference.
So I have two questions then.
Mm-hmm.
Why is interdisciplinary study important, and how are you affecting the sort of change in encouraging interdisciplinary study in Lehigh?
Sure. I can say interdisciplinary work itself is important because it actually captures the complexity of the problems and the solutions to those problems in the 21st century. As I was saying earlier, I found my own literary studies being deeply indebted to sociological work, political science, the social sciences, as well as, of course, aesthetics. So I find interdisciplinarity the natural way of being for myself. But what I also think is important is that we recognize that whatever we're talking about in terms of the looming or current crises of the 21st century, whether they're cultural crises, crises of intolerance, economics, environmental crises, scientific, et cetera, that no one discipline provides the sum total of the answer to how we address those. And so I think we do students a great disservice if we don't give them the many tools that they will need in order to make a difference in the world around them. Now, in terms of my own work as a dean, the most important thing I can do, I think, is hire good people. I mean, that's one of the foundational things that an administrator can do. Is as an example, we hire in my college, which is about 245 faculty now, we hire about 15 to 20 people per year. I see 3 to sometimes as many as 6 finalists for each one of those jobs. Those are dozens, sometimes well over 100 interviews in my office. I'm always asking the question, what is your work about, and how does that work address compelling social, cultural, scientific crises, and tell me how that work is influenced by thinking and by research outside of what you are calling yourself, whether it's a physicist, a chemist, it's a historian, an English professor, a philosopher, or whatever. So certainly by hiring the right people to put in front of those students is one of the most powerful ways I think an administrator can affect change.
Professor Hall, perhaps you can tell us a bit about your current research projects and future research projects.
In 2012, Anna Marie Jagos, who is another activist scholar in queer studies, she and I published the Routledge Queer Studies Reader, which really did attempt to bring together some of the most important interdisciplinary work in queer studies from the previous 2 to 3 decades. It was a challenging book to put together because the publishing industry, of course, in many ways is dominated by the English language medium. And what we hoped to do was to bring together in an anthology the international, multilingual conversation on sexuality, sexual diversity, and resistance to the norm. That's a challenge, and it's difficult because we had inevitably to face the fact that the publisher was not going to pay for translations. An American, UK, Australian audience, which is where the publisher primarily markets, would not really accept an anthology in which multiple languages were represented. So the final product, which we're very proud of, was a little more homogeneous than we had hoped, but still, I think, represents the very best anthology out there, capturing the full spectrum of voices in at least the English language medium on sexual diversity and challenges to sexual normativity. You know, at this point in my career, I'm about 23 years into my academic career. I've published 11 books, and I have several more probably in me somewhere. But what I think about often is how the work that I'm doing as an administrator, as an activist intellectual, how that is as important as publication. There's a book that I am slowly working on called Dialogic Intellectualism that really does look at how we learn through encounters with difference, how we learn as much by being challenged by that which is very different from us, whether disciplinarily or whether linguistically, culturally, or from a whole host of other points of difference, and how that generates new insight, new knowledge. The timetable is up in the air, but there will be another book, no doubt, around that topic, and probably at the end of my career, I want to publish a book called simply Bad Administration that looks at exactly what can go wrong in higher education, but I'll wait till the closing chapter of my career before I have my say on that.
The International Academic Forum tries to bring people together from all over the world, and it's an academic forum, it's a platform, but it's also a platform for change. It's a platform that we want to see used to affect societal change, as well as change within the academy, change outside the academy. So when we had the closing ceremony at this year's conference, you addressed the delegates with a sort of interdisciplinary call to arms. You said, what can you do when you go back home? I wondered if you could give us a brief sort of overview. What did you mean?
Well, I really want conferences to be generative, and generative not only of individual scholarship. I mean, we come to conferences, we're challenged, we meet new people, we hear new ideas, we go back, we may publish something. That's important, I don't want to deny that. But a conference like this and an organization like IAFOR becomes, as you said, a platform for a different type of change. What I wanted the delegates to think about is, how do they do the work of this conference, the challenging of boundaries, the opening of interdisciplinary discussions, the breaking down of the silos? How do they do that work back at their home institutions, with their students, in their professions, in their communities? And that, I think, is the most important thing that delegates can do out of a conference, is take it back home with them and not think of it as a closed event, but think of it as a launching pad. Because for me, an academic life has always been an activist life. Scholarship can be a form of activism. Publishing can be a form of activism. Certainly teaching can be a form of activism. Administration, as I said before, can be a form of activism. Every single person in that room, and there must have been 50 or so, every single person in that room can go back and can do important work. Foucault talked about the role of the specific intellectual, finding a terrain that you can intervene in from your own specific position and make a change. And I wanted all of the delegates to think long and hard about what he or she can do at home to do the work of IAFOR, so it's not simply a closed conference.
Well, Professor Hall, thank you very much for joining us. And I'd like to thank you also for joining us, and I hope that you can follow us on our Facebook page, where you can see a number of videos, or on our YouTube media channel, or at www.iafor.org.